Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and thank you very much, Joshua, for joining us in Rijeka for the first time. I don't think we need much introduction because I'm sure many here in Croatia have heard or know about the work of Joshua Oppenheimer. But just briefly, Joshua Oppenheimer is an acclaimed film director from the United States, currently living in Copenhagen in Denmark. Here in Croatia, as else in the world, everyone knows about his two movies, Act of Killing and Look of Silence, which will also be shown tomorrow at Art Kino in Rijeka, and for his work, which is very specific for decades, in which way he worked with different groups, killing squads and so on, but also his early work is very interesting, and it was inspired also by his mentor Dusan Makavejev, which will also be one of the topics of this conversation at Filozofski Teatar tonight. I'm very excited that Joshua came to Rijeka with the pre-premiere of his newest movie, The End, which was just shown at Art Kino, which will also be first part of our conversation on that. But first of all, thanks so much for coming to Rijeka. I'm very excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So let's start from the end. I mean, from the end of the world, but also from your movie, The End, which I hope many of you just had the opportunity to watch. I know everyone asks you this question: how come that, you know, a documentary filmmaker switched genres and now did a musical? But actually, for us who have watched Act of Killing, we know that it could also be described as a kind of genocide musical, and that the main character, Anwar Congo, was influenced, besides Western, also by Elvis Presley musicals. And of course, there is this, one of the most fascinating, there are many, but one of the most fascinating scenes in Act of Killing is the one with the waterfall and Born Free. So for me, it wasn't such a big surprise, but I would love to ask you, why do you say that it's a natural genre shift from documentary to musical, and why is musical the perfect genre for the apocalypse?
Yeah, I think there's two ways of answering this. There's something sacred about documentary footage, or about non-fiction film footage, where you're filming people who are playing themselves, because what you're doing is not just a ritual of play. It's actually coextensive part of their actual lives, and therefore part of the world. And when you, thank you, when, no, thank you. When you see the, when participants in a documentary crack and expose secrets that they themselves were not aware of, there's a kind of sacred vulnerability present. And I think there would be something disappointing about making the shift from documentary, or from the kinds of documentaries I make anyways, to ordinary drama, where you might feel you've entered the realm of the pretend. But somehow, when you are working with musical in the way I did with The End, where you have non-professional singers, but highly musical actors, singing in the authentic, honest voice of the character in absolute crisis, you've kind of skipped the pretend and are back in the realm of the sacred, because there's this sacred vulnerability all over again. I think when I introduced The End a moment ago, or a few hours ago, I said there's a kind of radiant vulnerability here. I think I was looking, having worked with radiant vulnerability in The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, I felt I needed a genre that I couldn't give that up. And then of course, for me, the fact that The End is a musical is what makes it a film about storytelling, about our species' unique capacity to lie to ourselves. And then, as I said earlier when I introduced the film, the awful consequences of that self-deception. It's really the genre that appears to be, pretends to be in its golden age form, about a kind of optimism and hope, the idea that no matter what, the sun will come out tomorrow, that no matter what, our future is bright. But that is not hope. that's actually the wolf of despair in the sheep's clothing of hope. Because if you remain completely passive with your head buried in the sand, in the face, as you know you're accelerating toward the abyss, then you are unable to change course because you're either too scared or too defensive or too despairing or even too ashamed to acknowledge your mistakes. And if you can't acknowledge your mistakes, if you can't acknowledge your destructive patterns, you can't change, and therefore you're doomed.
To come back to the musical a bit, I think you made a very interesting and fascinating inversion. So in the golden age of musicals in Hollywood, but also in Bollywood, like when people would sing, it would usually be to utter something which is too difficult to pronounce in words. So they would sing their inner truths, emotional truths, and so on. But unlike that, in the end, basically what they do is they sing. It's another level of denial. So they lie to themselves. You know, how did you come up with that concrete idea that it would be this way?
Yeah, well, exactly. And the cliche about the golden age musical is that when people they sing when their truth is too big for speech. And when you write a new musical, you sort of guess where the songs go. You feel where they belong. And I kept feeling they belong in moments of unease. Moments of they belong when characters are experiencing a crisis of doubt, when the lies, the stories, the fantasies that they've told themselves and that they cling to normalize their situation, and indeed, in order to normalize it, to celebrate it and romanticize it, these lies that allow them to wake up in the morning and get out of bed and continue their absurd rituals. I felt that the songs should come out of moments of doubt when these lies and fantasies unravel and fall apart because truth has pierced their bubble. And in that sense, in those moments, I feel the characters are rather like victims of a shipwreck who've been thrown overboard and sort of desperately looking for scraps so that they don't drown. They try to cobble together a life raft. They look for new music, new melodies, new modes of romanticizing their situation so that they can continue to hope, really. But again, it's this false hope. And so I realized that really we were very often creating songs that were these luminously beautiful, because I think Joshua Schmidt wrote luminously beautiful music, luminously beautiful lies, but with these rich, dark counterpoints in the orchestration that sort of inexorably lead the characters or pull the characters toward the truth, like a kind of undertow at the beach. You know, you swim and there's in the waves and there's an undertow or torrent or riptide that pulls you down. They're kind of being, as they try to sing these melodic lies, they try to convince themselves through singing of these new lies. They're drawn toward the truth by the music and by the sincerity of their effort and their feeling. And the lies start to crumble, and they hit these walls of silence. And that's where the truth really screams through. So it's also why when I introduced the film, I think I said, you know, listen to the dialogue, listen to the music, but also listen to the silence, because this is a film where often the music is full of lies, even if it's sincere, and the truth is in the silence.
Yeah, it's obviously a movie for our contemporary times where apocalypse is on everyone's lips, and also the geopolitical situation looks like that. And for the last years, we have been bombarded by the news about the super rich. I mean, we can see some super yachts here in Rijeka itself, which cost like $500 million. And we have been bombarded by this news about the rich escaping to New Zealand or to Mars and so on. So I think apocalypse became a kind of a common word today, and also fascination. My question is, where do you think comes this fascination with the end and the end of the world, which is, of course, not contemporary as much as we are in a very unprecedented time with extinction, climate crisis, and so on, but it was here, I think, since the first cave paintings. And also, have you been, I mean, obviously, maybe you can talk a bit more about your fascination with the apocalypse. When did it start? And also, there is this scene which I mentioned already, an act of killing at the waterfall, well, me, who is also fascinated by the apocalypse, it's obvious that it's being shot at the Lake Toba, which was a result of a super volcano which erupted 75,000 years ago, and then we had like maybe thousands of humans around the planet. Were you already at that time, when you were shooting Act of Killing at that Lake Toba, were you already thinking about this kind of time frame and the apocalypse and the end of the world? And where does your fascination with the apocalypse come from?
I think that I think actually, Srećko, if I can do this, if I'm allowed to do this,
of course you can do whatever you want.
You've written about the apocalypse in such a clear way that it actually helps me articulate what I'm thinking. So you've talked about in your book After the Apocalypse, you talk about the apocalypse in its Greek etymological sense of a revealing or an uncovering. And I think the idea that we all know that the end is already here. It's already embedded in the logic of our dysfunctional, destructive behavior now. So I've been struggling to express this about the film, how, you know, it appears to be a science fiction film set in the near future, but really it's a distillation of our present. And the idea that after the apocalypse in the title of your book means after the uncovering, after the revelation inherent in our current moment, that we are doomed, we are heading straight for the abyss, like the cartoon character Wile E. Coyote that runs off the edge of the cliff and just keeps going, telling himself, I'm going straight ahead after the Roadrunner, but really he's already in free fall. That idea that unless we change our self-deceptions, unless we intervene in the stories we're telling ourselves by which we normalize and naturalize our destructive behavior, we are already dead. We are already doomed. That's, I think, why there's a global, universal fascination with the apocalypse, because we already know it, and then we're living in this state of terrible evil, I would even say, cognitive dissonance, where we're on the one hand knowing that, and on the other hand convincing ourselves through our everyday practice that we're not headed straight toward the abyss. Now, in my work, and in the end, the film The End, I see the apocalypse as our mortality. You write in your book that the apocalypse is supraliminal, by which you mean something too big for us to grasp, sort of the opposite of subliminal, something that's happening so subtly that we don't notice it. The apocalypse, our extinction, the inevitability of our extinction is too big for us to grasp, but it demands that we grasp it. We are ethically it is demanded of us now that we grasp it, and that we come together. We marshal all of our creativity. We we step outside of our little bunkers of our nuclear families, outside of our social media-induced isolation, and come together as we all are here right now as a human family in radical solidarity to change, and to in a deeply transformative way, or else as we all know, we're headed toward extinction. So, but this idea that the apocalypse, and now I'm going to move from the species level of the whole species to something quite personal, this idea that the apocalypse, or that our extinction is supraliminal, too big for us to grasp, because, as you put it, it happens outside of history. It's not an event in history, it's the true end of history. That's true of death, too. Each and every one of our deaths, that's true, because that's an event that happens outside of life. And there is a lyric in The End that I guess I wrote, but the girl Moses Ingram sings, which is when she gets the gift of a watch from the sun, which is this kind of capitalist chronometer, really. It's just a measuring device to quantify time. And having lived a life wandering a dead earth where at least seconds and possibly minutes were quite irrelevant, at least in in their scientific dimension, in their length. She's left alone and feeling acute loneliness and homesickness for her family that had a radically different way of living, but also dying and accepting dying. And she gives voice to that when she listens to the seconds on this watch. She's never seen a working watch before. I wish I could see you, or I would ask, I sort of can. How many of you have seen the film?
Yeah, I can see many.
Okay, so most of you. Okay, so I don't have to.
You can spoil it a bit.
I can spoil it a bit, and I don't have to rehearse, summarize scenes you've just watched. So she's listening to the seconds ticking past, and she sings, "The seconds ticking past so fast. Before you notice them, they're gone forever. But I remember time when moments did not disappear. When I closed my eyes, a single breath could go on forever. So how few breaths we might have left meant nothing much at all." And sort of building on that the apocalypse is the end of history, but it's the event to which we are all indebted, because the ultimate meaning of our history depends entirely on how we come together as a family to prevent it. And death is the event outside of life, but is the compass within which all meaning exists in life. The question then is, how shall we live, how shall we die? And it's the same question. And there's a mantra that my husband Shu, my husband, I'm married to a Japanese man named Shu, who I've been with for 27 years. He's from a little neighborhood in the huge Japanese city of Fukuoka, where Zen Buddhism first arrived in Japan. And he's not a practicing Buddhist at all, but he had this mantra drummed into him as a child, and I'm a practicing neurotic, so he's constantly reminding me of this mantra. And it just goes like this. It is in my nature to grow old. It is in my nature to get sick. It is in my nature to lose the people I love. It is in my nature to die. How then shall I live? And I would say, if you just replace that with we, how then shall we live? Which then becomes the same as how then shall we die? There's a radical sense in which the apocalypse, in the kind of narrative sense, has always been a metaphor for death at the intimate sense. And that's always been the source of all our ethics. And that's, I think, the source of its enduring fascination for me. And in the end, in the film, The End, we have... It's funny how I have to keep saying in the film, because of the title. In the end is its own cliche. But in the film, the sort of challenge of the movie is that it always, every moment exists on these two levels. The family is the entire human family living after the apocalypse. And it's these nameless characters are nameless because they're me, and they're my parents, and they're my siblings, and they're my loved ones. And I hope for you, they're you as well. So it's the whole human family, and it's each and every one of our families.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, that was my impression also, and my feeling after watching the movie, that of course it's about a very privileged part of humanity and the super rich who caused the end of the world, and who are, as we speak, causing it by drilling more baby drill, as Donald Trump said, and now they want the minerals in Ukraine, and so it's all about extraction again. But at the same time, I think by watching the movie, me at least, I don't know about you in the audience, you get a feeling about your own moral dilemmas, you know, when, for instance, Tilda Swinton says that we had to draw the line somewhere, and well, they drew the line and part of her family didn't end up in the bunker. It also poses the question to ourselves, you know, in which way we draw the line on a daily level, not on that scale, of course, but on a daily level when we see a beggar on the street or we don't help someone and so on. So in that sense, I think it's not just about the super rich, but also about us, especially with the stranger, with the girl who appears with the honesty, and actually serves as this kind of provoker of the unconscious and of denial, and everything comes to the surface with her. But my question is now pointed towards the super rich, because obviously the origin of the movie came from your, maybe you could tell a bit more about that, from your visit to a super bunker with a rich person. And you talked about that already in some of your appearances and interviews. But what you didn't talk about publicly, and you revealed it to me when we were watching at this super yacht by the Qatari Emir here in the port, was that you were actually invited by some billionaires to show the movie to them. And in the movie you just mentioned the watch, and you constantly have this great performance, by the way, by everyone, but also by George McKay, the son, who is writing the memoirs of his father or whatever it is, not memoirs, but a book, which is kind of whitewashing him. And then he repeats the words of the father, you know, time is money, we have to care about productivity. And when you look at it in the end, the movie, The End, you see how ridiculous that is. You know, when the world is ending and we are faced with extinction, to talk about productivity or time is money is really ridiculous. So what were the reactions of the billionaires who watched your movie? Did they also find it ridiculous how they themselves are still sticking to those ideas? Were they in denial? Did it touch them? Yeah, I'm very curious to hear how did they see the movie.
Yeah, the film has been really polarizing. And I think that's because the premise of it, that, you know, if you just read the premise, that a wealthy family in a bunker after the end of the world, a golden age musical, what's no less, sort of seems to promise a kind of eat the rich satire. And I think people who come into the film, and as I implored you to do at the introduction, just watch the faces and listen to the voices. Soon, I think, understand that they're being invited to see richly drawn human beings. They're being invited to see themselves. But I think the people who cling to the hope that they're going to be treated to a chance to look at, and indeed point fingers at, people who are loathsome, who've done terrible things, thereby reassuring themselves as viewers that they're good people, enjoying that moral superiority, they find the film a tough watch, I'm sure, because they're dying for some kind of, you know, vengeance or comeuppance, when actually we're looking at these people's souls. But if you imagine you're a billionaire and you hear the premise of the movie and you're expecting satire, but you haven't, the one luxury that billionaires wouldn't have is the luxury of distance and feeling like, well, I'm superior because I'm not a billionaire. So if you imagine you're that billionaire, then when you're suddenly presented not with monsters, but human beings, it's probably quite comforting, and I think, in my experience from the people I've shown it to, disarming. So, you know, after screening the film in one very wealthy man's home, we then all sat outside and talked about the film for, I don't know if we finished it at 9 at night until 1 in the morning, so for 4 hours or so. And he just kept asking, you know, what are the choices I'm making? What are the choices I'm making? And then he would say, I've got to think about that. And then his wife would say, yes, but that's exactly what the film's telling us to think about. And he's saying, yes, I know. And then he would sort of get quiet and fall into a kind of just contemplative spiral. And I don't know if this led to change, but I know that they invited me back to show the film to more friends of theirs. And there were similarly thoughtful reactions, and one of the reactions that kind of puzzled me was an offer to finance my next film. Now that could be a very bad sign. And this film was financed by, this film, if nothing else, is a plea for the public sphere. I mean, this film is a plea, is a condemnation of what happens when we define ourselves narrowly in terms of private interest. It's a condemnation of who we become, who we are, I should say, now in a world where we identify and protect the nuclear family in opposition to the wider human family. It's what J.D. Vance said recently, speaking of his America First agenda. He said, you know, of course, the Bible teaches us, it's Christian teaching, that we should care first and foremost for our families, then our neighbors, then our nation. And then if we have a little empathy left over, the rest of the planet. And Pope Francis actually had to say, no, you're a new Catholic. And that's not actually how we imagine, that's not actually Catholic morality. And of course, to J.D. Vance, Pope Francis is a fake pope. So I don't think the message landed. But this film is, if nothing else, a plea for the public sphere and for the widest human family. And as a movie, it's completely unimaginable. I mean, it is a miracle that this movie exists. This is not a film that you can just easily imagine getting financed. And it's only financed because of, you know, the support of some 70 public arts bodies that came together to create it. And so I don't think but the fact that an oligarch wanted to get in on that game and said, oh, I'd like to fund your next movie, even if I don't take the money, I think might be a good sign. But I can't tell you how I've touched their souls, but I was very eager to go show the film to them and very eager to listen to them wrestle with it and very eager to go back and show it to them. And you asked me an interesting question. You asked, which it never even occurred to me, was I paid to go show the film? And I wasn't. And it actually hadn't occurred to me to ask. And I think to ask for money, it hadn't occurred to me. And I think I would have felt corrupted had I been paid to do that.
Except if it was huge money or a super yacht. I'm joking. No, I'm joking, but I think you just made a very good point, because when we look at our contemporary situation today, what you can see is that the West itself is turning into a sort of Russia. You know how in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically it became the wives of oligarchs who founded new museums of contemporary art and so on. And you can now more and more see it also in Silicon Valley. So in that sense, I'm not surprised that they approached you and said that they would finance another movie, because obviously the public sector is not just disappearing, but being intentionally destroyed. And the oligarchs are becoming the ones who are now, like in good old times with the Medicis and so on, who are now supporting arts.
I think, to be honest, that's how it's always been in the United States. I mean, with this, you know, that's how it's always been with the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Morgans and the Guggenheims. Yeah, and I think constitutionally speaking, the United States is some kind of constitutional republic with various elections and checks on power, so it hasn't become a full-on autocracy until now, when it is, I think, on the verge of becoming a true autocracy. And of course it always was for its black citizens and the victims of its genocides. But I think it has always been a kind of constitutional oligarchy.
Yeah, which brings us directly to my next question on our contemporary situation. You already mentioned Vance. We have all been watching with shock, I would say. I mean, some European leaders were literally crying at the Munich Security Conference or Munich Insecurity Conference, which happened when Vance came there for the first time. In the meantime, we have seen Elon Musk parading with the chainsaw he got from Javier Milei, saying that, you know, we have to cut the state completely. We have seen this bizarre AI-generated Trump-Gaza video where you can see Donald Trump and Netanyahu drinking cocktails and Elon Musk eating hummus. We have also seen Zelensky being bullied at the White House by Vance and Trump. How do you look at it with the background of act of killing, where you also had killers celebrating publicly what they did? And why is it so shocking and absurd? and what kind of theater is it what we are looking at? Because obviously it is a sort of political theater. And last but not least, does it maybe have some characteristics of musical when you watch this Trump and all of them together?
Yeah, that's a very, I mean, it's difficult to answer. No, maybe that's why it's difficult. But I also think that I just returned home from the United States, and it's really like trying to, answering your question is like trying to create a watercolor of the landscape in the middle of a 7.5 earthquake. You know, it's just really difficult to describe how the state of rupture that we're in right now. But let me just sort of pick at the bits, the morsels there that I think I can work with. As a Jew, let's start with Gaza. There is a genocide happening now in my name as a Jew in Gaza, and really against the Palestinian people as a whole living in Gaza and the West Bank. And I cannot tell you how furious, ashamed, and heartbroken it makes me. My grandparents and my father's parents and my stepmother's parents fled Europe. My stepmother's parents from Vienna, my father's parents from Frankfurt and Berlin, to escape the Holocaust. And the idea that we are now doing this to other people is so, and then so sickening, and that I will be called all sorts of names should these comments get on the radar of the defenders of this policy, because I'm saying, no, I don't want this done in my name. I don't want this done at all. It is utterly horrifying. So let me just start with that. That Gaza video that you described, the AI-generated Gaza video, is grotesque because, of course, you have this computer-generated, inhumanely generated landscape that's would already look apocalyptic if it were not predicated on the erasure of all the people who live there. Presumably the killing of everyone who lived there, because they're not leaving voluntarily and there's nowhere for them to go. So once they're all dead, all 2 million of them, there's Donald Trump and Musk and Netanyahu partying. And it's not unfamiliar to me. In my film, The Look of Silence, there's an NBC News program where Ted Yates is walking through Bali with a Balinese death squad leader who's saying quite sincerely, Bali is now more beautiful without the communists because they're all dead. And Ted Yates is nodding along in agreement and presenting this to America as if, yes, of course, Bali would be more beautiful when all the communists are dead. And for decades after that, Americans and Europeans have gone and had beautiful holidays in their minds, haunted holidays, in 5-star resorts along the Balinese coast. But when nature, and that's the key in my films, nature sometimes takes revenge. When nature takes its revenge or comes as a kind of avenging angel from the future and washes away the beach at the Hyatt Regency Bali Resort, and 150 skulls wash out onto the beach from beneath the coconut palms, it's only mildly upsetting for the holidaymakers because decades have passed. I don't know what to say. I think this is a moment for allowing ourselves to feel dwarfed by nature. The only thing I can compare that AI video to, in my own experience, is a scene, the scene you mentioned from The Act of Killing, where Anwar Congo stages his redemption at the Sipiso Piso waterfall at the north end of Lake Toba, and there's this huge waterfall, and there's dancing girls, and there's a choral rendition of Born Free. And in the kind of musical interlude in the middle of the song, his victim gives him a medal. They're supposed to be in heaven, and says, "Thank you for killing me and sending me to heaven." And then from that moment, which is sort of in a kind of medium long shot, there's a cut to an extreme long shot where they're tiny beneath this enormous cliff, beneath this enormous waterfall, and they're just dwarfed by nature that is seen through their eyes, romanticized through their eyes, but still dwarfing them. It's giving the lie to the whole fucking thing. Just like that storm that washed the skulls away would be giving the lie to the whole fucking thing. And just as the same were it to happen on the shore of the Trump mega resort in Gaza, would give the lie to the whole thing. And so yes, when self-deception, when so much of our culture is a defensive lie, where we tell heroic stories about ourselves again and again and again, no matter how destructive we are, no matter how much we kill, exploit, extract, oppress, we tell another heroic story about ourselves. Or we make it, when we're tired, when the excuses we make for our behavior, individually and collectively, starts to wear thin, then we go for some kind of romantic, but ultimately cheap heroics. And yes, that's exactly the logic of a musical, and that's why the end is a musical. But it also has the quality, and you see that, I learned this from making The Act of Killing, really. It has the quality, and the Look of Silence, it has the quality of bullying. Because there's a scene in The Act of Killing, but it's just an example of this being the general dynamic of the culture, where the paramilitary group that participated in the mass killings is dramatizing the slaughter of a village, a pogrom really, in a village. And one of the leaders of the paramilitary movement, who's now the deputy minister of youth and sport for the whole country, calls, cut, 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 cut. We have to throw this footage away because it makes us look bad. But then he sort of realizes, wait a moment, I only am in power because I'm feared. So he says, no, let's keep this because it shows how terrifying we can be. I realized that actually the perpetrators boast about their atrocities for two quite different reasons at the same time. And if they're emotionally invested in one, the other is also operational. If they're emotionally invested in the other's operational. And those are, first of all, to reassure themselves that what they did is right, beautiful, romantic, exciting, sexy, whatever. And on the other hand, to intimidate, because they can. Because impunity requires performance, its own performance. If you have power and you enjoy impunity, you'd better flaunt it so that people know not to cross you. So I think that's where the musical, the golden age musical, becomes frightening, because it's not just sincerely felt self-deception that soars on these beautiful harmonies. The lies also can become an in-your-face boasting and flaunting, and you see that in that Gaza video, you see that in the Born Free clip in The Act of Killing, or the state television talk show that's celebrating the killings that was made on the occasion of the shooting of The Act of Killing. And you see it in Donald Trump's inaugural address, in his address to Congress the other night, where he said, in both cases, our golden age begins now.
Also, when you just mentioned cut, cut, cut from the act of killing, it actually reminded me on that scene which I already mentioned at the White House with Vance and Trump and Zelensky, when at the end of this almost 10 minutes of bullying Zelensky, Donald Trump says, well, this was good TV. So you can see that, you know, I mean, you had two actors, Zelensky an actor and Donald Trump an actor, where Donald Trump was obviously a more successful actor, who is fully aware in the same way the main characters of Act of Killing are fully aware of the performance of, just a comment, that's not a question.
No, but it's a very important point, because one of the things I noticed in Trump, which shows that he's a good entertainer, is that he can be a tough guy for a while, but actually, if you watch it, he also has a charisma that allows him to sort of wrap it up and seem reasonable. And that's a performance that we know from, you know, I don't know, Marlon Brando's portrayal of the Godfather in Godfather 1. It's the same kind of, yeah, I'm threatening you, but actually it's okay, I'm reasonable, I'm a nice guy. So we can come away and look forward to the next episode, because we haven't totally withdrawn our identification with him. There's still something in his there's still something in his aura that we actually, and it's awful to say, but admire.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I mean, Rijeka, not Rijeka that much, but Croatia as such is pretty insignificant on a geopolitical level, I would say, today. Unlike the times when Galeb and the non-aligned movement were part of our history and future. To say Gaza is a genocide in Croatia, I think doesn't have that much heavyweight as it has when you say, and you said the same last month in Berlin at the Berlinale, precisely in those words, and that it shouldn't be committed in your name as a Jew. Did you face, I mean, we've followed what was happening in Germany during the last year, I mean, with canceling Adania Schiebli from Frankfurt Book Fair, to, you know, the German minister applauding just to the part of the team of No Other Land, which was pretty ridiculous, and many people were cancelled, and still they're being cancelled, and cuts in culture and so on. Did you face any problems for your political stance so far, you know, in the sense of someone wouldn't fund your next movies, or some sort of political pressure, especially when you said something like that in contemporary Germany?
Not yet, and maybe it's because I'm a German Jew. I have a German passport because of my family applying for citizenship again, ironically because they're scared of the autocracy that's coming to the United States. But I have, in the past, when the act of killing came out, I was questioned. I actually gave an interview for the Jewish Chronicle, which is an American Jewish paper, and I said that, you know, I was talking about how Anwar Congo makes cowboy Western scenes, among other genres, musical we've talked about, and I was asked the question, isn't it grotesque to make a Western, you know, cowboy scenes about genocide? And I said, why? Cowboy scenes have always been about genocide. That's what the whole genre is for. And so isn't it just honest? Aren't we actually shining a light on how this lie functions? We're sort of de-fetishizing the fetish. We're showing the labor that goes into creating the fetish. And I said that, and then that led to, I said, you know, and here I am talking to the Jewish Chronicle. I just want to say, you know, the United States was founded on ethnic cleansing, and so was Israel. And then I had a whole series of talks canceled. But that was a long time ago. I'm sure the situation would be more serious. I saw today or yesterday, Donald Trump canceled $400 million of funding for Columbia University because he claims that the university is not protecting students from anti-Semitism, which is grotesque. I mean, a grotesque accusation.
Yeah, I would love to come back a bit, going back to the past. You announced and dedicated the pre-premiere of The End here in Rijeka to your great mentor, Dušan Makavejev, and his wife, Bojana. I know you met them a few times. Makavejev was also a good friend of mine. He was visited the Subversive Festival. You met, I think, both in Zagreb and Belgrade. But your friendship started at Harvard when you were his student. My question is actually about the importance of the influence of Dusan Makavejev. What was precisely in his work what inspired you, and what are you taking further in your own work from Mak?
Permission. The liberation of radical permission. I remember I just felt I didn't learn anything of practical value, except for one thing which I actually talked about earlier, which was the importance, and you've just seen in the end, how vital locations are. He said that right away. He said there's nothing more important to a film than the locations. And on one of the last time I saw him when he was fully there, fully present, he had some dementia at the end, but the last time I saw him when he was fully present, we took a boat down the Danube in Belgrade, and I just recognized from the film the location where the end of WR is shot. And I said, Dusan, is that where you shot the end of WR? And he said, exactly. And that's why I always say the most important thing in a film are the locations, because they speak the truth. They upstage your characters and speak the truth. And they expose the characters' delusions for what they are. And that's the same as the salt mine in the end. It's the same as the paintings, the figurative paintings especially. I mean, the paintings of people especially that upstage Tilda and Michael and George, that sort of witnesses from a time when those paintings actually meant something from before the apocalypse, gazing out at us and reminding us of the abyss of meaning in which these characters have thrown themselves. That's something I learned from him, but really it was liberation. He gave me the freedom to make the act of killing, to make the look of silence, and to make the end.
Yeah, speaking of locations, I didn't pose it at the start. So the end was shot, I think, in 3 weeks in a salt mine in Sicily. And I find it also interesting, since you just mentioned paintings, that there is a history connecting salt mines and the preservation of arts. So for instance, one famous example is the salt mine in Austria, near Linz, where the Nazis stored something like 6,000 paintings by, Rubens, Rembrandt, and so on, because Hitler wanted to create a super museum in Linz, the town where he was born, and also many other stories of bunkering arts. So we could speak obviously about the paintings and arts, but I'm more interested now in the process of filming. How did it look like to film there? And also maybe one question which brings us also back to your early influences. When I watched The End, and obviously it's a musical, but it's very theatrical. The setting, the stage, the scenography, it looks like very good theater, I would say. So maybe also if you could go back, I know that at the start, before you became a documentary filmmaker, you were doing for 6 months street theater in India, in Calcutta. And then, how did you then turn to documentary filmmaking? And too many questions, I know. Salt mine is one, and how did it look like? And the second one, maybe to go deeper, we are in this gorgeous theater, which you still can't see, but we will switch on the lights very soon to get some questions from you. The connections between your movies and theater itself, what have you learned from theater, and how much did theater influence your last movie, The End?
Okay, let's take this. When you have to eat an elephant, you start in a corner. So let's just take this in pieces, Srećko.
Yes, yeah, I saw it.
So no, it's good. It's good. So I'm going to go way back, but let's do it like this. I'm going to give you some keywords.
Yes.
So I'll talk about theater a little bit. Let's talk about
salt mine.
Let's talk about the oligarch's art collection, and let's talk about salt mine. Theatricality in the end. then the theatricality of the end, and then the salt mine, and then the salt mine.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to go all the way back then. So I went to university with it, not intending to study in the arts or even philosophy, but to study theoretical physics and cosmology. In fact, as an Oppenheimer, I interested in physics in my teenage years. I had an apocalyptic imagination. Growing up in a decade, the 1980s, when kids my age in the United States were terrified of nuclear annihilation, the apocalypse was a very personal and living metaphor in my daily life. And in fact, I grew up I finished high school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I would gaze across the Rio Grande Valley in the evening at the lights of Los Alamos twinkling on the slopes of the Jemez Mountains, some 30 miles away. And I used to have a recurring nightmare where I'd go up to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I'd look across the valley, and there was just blackness. There was inky blackness. There was no light at all coming from Los Alamos, and that's how I knew there had been an atomic catastrophe. So this is a tangent just about why maybe I've been obsessed with the apocalypse forever and found this metaphor for mortality in it. But I was really interested in physics, especially because I was interested in the nature of consciousness. In quantum mechanics, when you observe something, your conscious mind causes the wave-like superimposition of every possibility to collapse into one possibility, whatever it is that you observe. So the present becomes this kind of, in a void of interconnectedness, the present of which we are each conscious becomes the moment of pure possibility where things interact and resolve. And I was totally fascinated by the idea that if we are energy, because remember, according to Einstein, matter and energy are the same, there's an equivalence. We are energy manifest as matter, that there must be some role of consciousness in the physical fabric of being. And it's kind of obvious because I sort of see you in the front row there. You have a brain, you have neurons, but somehow, and I can describe that as atoms and molecules interacting, but if I were you, you'd be looking at me and having feelings about me and what I'm saying. And the idea that there's an interiority to energy, which we all experience as consciousness in some form. And maybe there's an interiority to the Amazon rainforest as a kind of giant system of interconnected roots that function like neurons that's conscious in some very slow rhythm that we don't know how to communicate with. That totally fascinated me, and when I went to university, I was quickly directed towards engineering, because that's what physics at Harvard was doing with its students back then, and away from these questions. So I very quickly, after a semester or two, jumped ship and started to study philosophy. And then had always been interested, because of my interest in the nature of consciousness, in acting, and was a kind of probably not very good actor in high school, but then got interested in the empathy I felt for different characters to write plays, and wrote probably not a very good playwright in high school, but I was writing and producing plays as a kind of side hobby. And then I became interested in the idea that all identity is inherently performative, and I gave an example earlier of like the dual function of making a musical number, for example, musical scene, for example, celebrating your role as a mass murderer in a genocide. One, to reassure yourself. Two, to silence other people. That idea that you're creating yourself through the stories you tell about yourself, that we create collectively the world through the stories we tell about it, that we unconsciously, collectively create kind of this incredible structure or matrix from which our stories emerge, namely language. And I think it's worth noting that, like, in the same sense that termites unconsciously build these incredible vaulted nests, having no idea where that geometry comes from, what is our great collective process of creation? It's constant, that we're constantly building and renovating and maintaining and changing and adapting. It's language. And from that, we then create stories, and then we know and create the reality ourselves and our reality through the stories we tell about it. Then it becomes a question of politics, morality, ontology, epistemology, what stories we tell. And for me, the idea that so much of our storytelling is just defensive rationalization or sentimentalization because we feel guilty. We know we've done something wrong. And then rather than admit it, rather than experience the shame of admitting our guilt in front of others, we lie about it, we defend it, we romanticize it, we celebrate it, we whitewash it. And that enables us to commit further evil. That through our morality, actually, the fact that we know the difference between right and wrong, we then defensively double down and become worse and worse and worse in this kind of apocalyptic or catastrophic spiral that we're on now. That to me made me realize that storytelling and working with performance was what I was going to do and be what was going to be my way of exploring the nature of reality and consciousness, not quantum physics. And then I took this, I tried to find ways of bringing theater into a political space and got internships working with people using street theater to organize a sex workers union in Calcutta. I was just really an intern on that project. The organizers were all Bengali, but it was profoundly traumatizing because these were girls who were 13, 14 years old, 12 years old. Actually, some were even younger. I don't know why I said started with 13, 14, start with 11 and 12, who had been sold into sex work or taken from their parents because who were in debt and put into brothels. It was traumatizing, that year I spent. I took a year out in the middle of university. Harvard is a rich university and actually gave me a grant to go do that. And it was a really eye-opening, traumatizing year. And somehow at the end of that, I decided that I would become a filmmaker. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but I just decided that. And then Dushan, when I came back from that year off, Dushan was my teacher, and he just encouraged me to be free. And so going to your question about the theatricality of, so that's my interest, that's where my interest in theater came from. But I think when you talk about the theatricality of the end and the salt mine, it's actually coming from something quite different. I think we just are using the word theater. It's like what Wittgenstein calls language on holiday. Like these are not the same theater we're talking about. Once I understood, as I said earlier, that the musical numbers, the songs in the end, are very often desperate attempts by the characters to convince themselves of new lies, new delusions, that they are dramatically I said they're lying to themselves, but they're not lying to themselves in the sense that they're escaping into a musical fantasy. They're actively struggling to convince themselves through song and failing often as they try to do that. Or else in certain instances, and this is just to acknowledge what you just saw, they're giving voice to real longing, which ultimately has in the case of especially the girls' song and the son and girls duet, and those songs have the potential, and those songs have the potential to rip the bunker apart and deepen their crisis, because longing is forbidden truth, really. But when they're singing these anthems and trying to convince themselves through song, at their most intense, these are emotional breakdowns in music. And when someone's breaking down with that level of vulnerability, the camera just you don't want to illustrate the crisis with a montage or a fantasy sequence. You simply want to bear witness. And so understanding that, out of that principle that these songs are these attempts to convince themselves, we developed a language of these very long takes, where especially in the songs we're in real time, unless there's a location change. And then the other, like when we shift from the mother's bathroom to the mine, there's obviously a cut there. And then but also for the very same reason, we realized that we weren't going to have 12 show-stopping production numbers, big musical extravaganzas. We're going to treat the music as a single breath, a single piece of music. Indeed, treat the entire film with its spoken scenes and its silences as a single piece of music, like a symphony, as you would a symphony. And that meant, and the reason we did that is we wanted the melodies to reprise, to keep coming back. And so that when a character sings a melody in its most fateful moment, you've heard it probably 2 or 3 times already, so unconsciously you're humming along with them as they sing. And my guess is, my hope is, that when you hum along with someone, as they sing, and you kind of identify with the biological rhythm of singing, and it's as if you slip into their skin and you're kind of haptically, in your body, identifying with them and feeling what it's like to lie to yourself. And so when they successfully convince themselves that they're living the most beautiful version of their lives, that when the mother convinces herself that she left her family behind in so many words so that she could be the perfect mother, when she convinces herself that, as they do, I won't go into more examples, but when they convince themselves in this way, that you too are believing it for a moment. And therefore that meant that the bunker should not be a kind of relentlessly claustrophobic kind of concrete affair like in a film like Downfall, for example. We should be able to forget that we're in a bunker with the characters sometimes, and that led to everything significant about the production design. First and foremost, we realized that if you're underground in a room without windows, a space without windows for 2.5 hours, you will be claustrophobic. And you will be claustrophobic not when I, as a filmmaker, want you to be claustrophobic. You'll be more and more claustrophobic until the end of the movie. And so we realized we needed somehow exteriors, and so we decided that the bunker should be kind of a compound of rooms, of finished, luxurious rooms built inside a much larger underground man-made mine, an artifact of the industrial civilization that led to the Earth's downfall, but still that mine would have some kind of dark beauty that would be a kind of exterior in counterpoint to those lavish interiors. Then we thought that the mother's art collection could serve as windows onto a lost nature, a nature that's gone because we destroyed it, but also one that never existed because the paintings are a romantic idealization, a fetishization of the natural world, not a real look at it. Also, lost people. You know, as Mother says when she looks at the painting she says she's trying to place a painting. She can't find the right place for a painting as they're trying to kick out a human being. She says, I wish I'd brought another one because this one's always staring at us. So the paintings became these windows. Then we developed this whole kind of, this whole lighting system of light wells through the skylights through the ceilings of the rooms through which came simulated daylight. And that light then diffuses through the rooms as you have in many art museums and you have in the White House. And then we just use certain colors also as a kind of visual relief or a kind of holder of longing. All of that grammar grew out of this principle that the songs make the film about delusion. And that ultimately is, I think, at the deeper level why the film, except for Moses' character, except for the girl until the very end, is theatrical, because they're always performing for each other. They are the audience of each other's lies and self-deceptions.
Whoa, I think you answered all my questions. But maybe one final question before you, the audience, will have opportunities to ask questions. You just said that they're performing for themselves, and in some of your previous interviews, you also said that when the camera, that's your experience as a documentary filmmaker, that when the camera is on, everyone is acting. So I have a question. I mean, I guess the camera is on there. You can see the red light of the camera, which is filming us there. We are on the stage of a theater. How much are you acting? Are you self-aware that, are you changing when you're on stage? How much are you self-aware of this, which you notice at your characters themselves?
Well, maybe that's a really beautiful question. I actually wonder about it sometimes. I'm going to go on a little personal tangent, if that's okay.
Sure.
I grew up in a family where there was divorce, and not just divorce, but my mother ended up on the other side of the North American continent. And I became so that, and it felt like, I think I was 6 years old, and it felt like a catastrophe. It felt like the kind of, like the ship of the ark of, on which my childhood was, through it, was the ship on which I was sailing through life was just, again, splintered and ripped apart. And I, in order to keep the bits and pieces that were still available to me close, and out of fear of losing them, I guess I fell into the role of reassuring everyone in my family, but especially my parents, that they had made all the right choices. I wasn't even conscious of my own feelings that maybe they hadn't, until much later when I started to feel the scars of loss. And I guess that I kind of lost myself in that, but I became a pleaser, someone who is a kind of, someone who pleases people and tries to please people and afraid of conflict. And when my father, in fact, first saw The End, he saw it with George Mackay, who plays the son, and afterwards he said, "My God, George, you really studied my son to play this role." And I was sort of alarmed, but on the other hand, I felt very seen and accepted by my dad, even if he was part of the reason I'd become that way. And I think when I made a documentary, and I'll come to how I feel on the stage, when I made a documentary, when I made my documentaries, actually, let me just say something general about documentary. I think what makes documentary footage cinematic always, but certainly in my films, is some kind of a gap between how the participants want to be seen, and now I'm talking about self-consciousness and how I might want to be seen by you on stage, but how the participants want to be seen on the one hand, and how they really see themselves on the other. And that gap is what makes, when I say that gap is what makes documentary footage cinematic, it's because that's what gives the materials what you would call in dramatic footage or in life subtext, a tension, an anxious distance, or an unresolved dissonance between those two levels. One that the participant is trying to control in her performance, and one which is involuntary. And you can never talk about that gap with your participants directly, because the moment you do, they become self-conscious, and it falls away. And making The End, my first narrative feature film, I had this feeling that I was working with people whose craft is to produce that gap, so we could talk about it. You know, Srećko, tell me that you love me, but say it like you want to punch me in the face. No, try it saying it like these little adjustments.
Really do it now, or no?
That's how I would work with an actor if I was trying to develop. We were trying to work on the subtext together, so we could talk about the subtext together, and that meant that the whole process was this incredible communion, or this. Where I could say, look, for me, the film is about this. This is why I care about it. This is why I'm making it. This is what this story means to me. This is the time I dropped a piece of ice on my dog as a child because I was ashamed of the kids laughing at me in the school. But to me, it's also really a story of impunity. What haunted me is when I came home and the dog acted like had forgotten it. That's what haunted me. And then that's an invitation for the actors to dig into their own personal history and to find really strong stories to bring into their work. But that sense, which they were free to tell me or not, but that sense of total transparency made me look back, and the possibility of, and the necessity of total honesty there, and the possibility of real conflict emerging from that. That made me look back on the process of documentary, made me imagine new documentaries and think how lonely the process of shooting a documentary is, because I can't talk about what makes the material great with the participant, even if I'm in total solidarity with that person, as I was with Ari Rukun in The Look of Silence. So somehow at now turning 50, I've just turned 50, being 50, looking, to me, that honesty involved with making narrative felt like a belated coming of age. And here I am, you asked this question about me on the stage, and when The Act of Killing first came out, I was terrified of speaking in public. I could never ask a question in a cinema. I mean, sorry, in a lecture or in a cinema, once I'd become a filmmaker, but in a lecture, I could never in college ask a question, which is why it also didn't help me in my journey to being a physicist, because back then you couldn't look up on YouTube about complicated mathematical proofs. So if you didn't understand the mumbling lecturer and you didn't dare ask a question, you were lost. So I was terrified of speaking in public. If you ask, how am I now? Is this a performance? It raises a real question of what is performance. Good performance is tapping into a moment. Am I putting on a mask? Am I putting on a persona? I don't think so. I think when I become self-conscious on stage and momentarily panic, which happens to me sometimes, it hasn't happened tonight, but it happens when I'm really tired, then I get self-conscious. Then I try to cling to a script and adjust my posture and constrain myself with a persona, and it's awful. But when I'm in the moment now with you, Srećko, and with you, who I barely see, I wish I could see you better.
Now it's coming soon,
But,
you'll see that.
but I feel like we are together here. And I feel like, and it gives me an energy, an extroversion, to be sure, because I can come away from a night like tonight. We'll go out to dinner. Afterwards, I'll go home and I'll feel completely empty. I was hiking in the Alps last spring when I was finishing The End, and I was thinking about the finishing of the movie, which took 8 years to make, and it was 3 weeks in the salt mine and 6 weeks in studios in Germany and Ireland for the interiors. But I was watching I came across a little puddle, and the puddle was filled with frog's eggs, and I said to Shu, look at the frog's eggs, and then I noticed next to the puddle was the empty body of the mother frog that must have released its eggs and died. I said, that's exactly how I feel finishing this movie. I had no idea at that point how I would have the energy to sit here and do this, but you give me this energy. Your book, which I reread today, part of, gives me this energy. But yeah, I'll feel completely empty tonight, and tomorrow I'll try and find the energy again for meeting some of you at the cinema.
Thanks so much for your honest and beautiful response, and also for the moment you're sharing with us. And the light is coming.
What a room.
Yeah, you can look at
It's a beautiful room.
It was supposed to be Gustav Klimt original, but I think it's being renovated.
Holy
so it's
shit.
going to come back at some point.
This is a very impressive room.
Yeah. Sorry? Aha. Thank you. Please, this is the moment which you can share with us with your questions. I can see one first question, but please wait for the mic. It's coming, so we can all hear you. U prvome redu, evo gospođa u bijelom.
Since this was all very, very serious, When you mentioned location is everything, it reminded me of real estate agents, you know, location, location, location. The thing is, not to digress, I'm a born optimist, so that's why I would like to ask you, what comes after the end? Is it this a fictional vision of people who have learned everything about the human race and sort of anticipate the end? Or is there a possible frog's eggs nesting and other frogs coming out, meaning that maybe that's not really the end? What comes after your vision of the end?
Nothing. And let me explain. I mean, I'm not an optimist, and I'm not a pessimist. I'm very hopeful. I wouldn't have made this wake-up call, this cautionary tale, if I did not believe there was time for us all to come together and heed the warning. And the hundreds of people who worked on it, especially those who were not just hired, I shouldn't say just hired, but those who were hired to do a technical job, but the people who really had to invest in the writing or in the acting or in the cinematography, they wouldn't have either. So we all made the film with a profound sense of hope. It may be too late for the family in the film, and it's nice that the lights have come on for this question, because you can see each other, but it's not too late for us. And when you leave the cinema tonight, or when you leave the theater now, because we're no longer in the cinema right now, remember? When we leave the theater, there will still be a sky overhead and a breathable atmosphere. And now is the time for, as Srećko put it in his beautiful book, After the Apocalypse, now is the time for radical transformation, to use your expression. Not kind of deferred hopes for some kind of romantic regeneration of the natural world after we're gone. I want to say something about the plankton that you see drifting in the end of the film, in the very final shot of the film. Mother and girl lie to themselves. They tell themselves, once the world was full of, they sing, once the world was full of strangers, we kept our distance, so many dangers, we trusted no one. We know girl is lying because we saw her when she arrived in the bunker, and she was nothing if not trusting of the family. And they fade away into the abyss, their fate sealed in their dishonesty. And as they fade away, we see what appears to be the Milky Way or the cosmos fading in. But then the cosmos are revealed to be the microcosmos, plankton. And if we should die from catastrophic climate change, if that's indeed how the end will come, and it may not come from that, but if that is how the end should come, the oceans will be too acidic, as they almost are already, for the calcium carbonates necessary for forming the endoskeletons of those plankton to form. So we're not looking at the primitive life that will remain when we're gone. We're either looking at life in 2 million years after the sulfurous, algae-choked mess of our oceans regenerates because the natural carbon cycle of the earth has restored the pH of the sea. Or else we are indeed looking at life on other planets. And lest we should romanticize that life, I hope that some of you noticed that the very last image before the cut to black and the start of the credits is one of those planktons, the most bizarre and fantastical looking one, flinching in terror. It's not having a good time. But then the music soars really, I think, beautifully with this run-up of strings, the melody of which, and this is a tangent, forgive me, is the lyric, is the melody by which the mother sings the word again and again in her song, We Kept Our Distance, disappeared. But there's this run-up of strings that happens twice where we get the credits. And it's the same run-up of strings that from the beginning, at the beginning we saw the paintings, these luminous views onto a lost nature. Then at the end, the same music comes, or similar music comes, and we get the credits. But we don't just see the names of the actors, we see a translation, a key. Mother, Tilda Swinton. Son, George Mackay. And we're reminded who wrote the film, who made the film. And with that hopeful music, we're reminded of the gesture of making, the labor that went into the movie. And so, but then, to just underscore my point that after the end comes nothing, we get this echo of the melody, "We trusted no one," as a kind of, and I don't know if they played the credits through to the end or if you all got up and left, but that's on a loop. And we put that on a loop of magnetic tape, and we played it and played it and played it for days until the magnetic filings on the tape wore off and clumped up in a kind of decomposition loop. It's kind of avant-garde music technique. And over the course of the credits, the signal fades away into pure noise. And I think this idea that has become so prominent and that you describe in your book as melancholy, this idea that, well, it'll be good, it'll be okay when we are gone because nature will regenerate in some beautiful way, is a consolation. But it's a totally passive one that prevents us from living honestly and doing what we know we need to do, which is to come together right now in solidarity. Reach out to your neighbors, reach out to your coworkers, reach out to your friends, and ask, what does this moment demand of us? Honestly. And I don't say this to be a scold or to push you. I say this because this time that you're spending right here with me and with each other, and whatever you do when you go home, and tomorrow, and me too, this is all we have. It's the question that Girl says, how it doesn't matter when the end is coming so long as we live honestly. How few breaths we might have left meant nothing much at all. It is in my nature to die. How then shall we live?
Thank you.
Thank you. And I suggest we take, thanks. I suggest, because I just looked at the watch, well, we have it still here and it makes some sort of sense. We take two questions, one after the other, and then you respond as a final round. So please, if you have, I can see here on the right, yes, please. And then we take a second question.
Hi. Joshua, here.
Here on the right.
First row.
Yeah, here.
Sorry. So you were talking about Dusan Makavejev as your mentor, but I wanted to ask you if you can say briefly something about do you have any role models in movie making, who are people you admire? Because both of your documentaries from 10 years ago or so, and this movie also that I watched tonight, have very original cinematic language and style, but I couldn't help notice tonight in the end, you talked about the locations. The salt mine is quite familiar with the salt mine of the room in the Stalker from Tarkovsky. It has quite a similar vibe. And the other thing is your filming of the paintings in the bunker are also, for me, reminiscent of Tarkovsky's work, because he tends to film paintings very slowly and very in his movies. So you know what I'm talking about. So it might be a fluke, but I want you to just say something about it.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll keep thanks for the great question, and we take another question. Last row, please raise the hand, and the mic is coming. If they don't, yeah, keep it raised. And you keep thinking about the first question.
I hate to step on the toes of the moderator, but because the whole time you were asking your question, I was looking at you. Do you still have a question too? No, we can get it after. We'll get a third.
Yeah, we'll get that question, and that you will get the last one.
Yeah,
so please.
I was looking at you in your eyes, waiting for the mic to get to you, and so I'd feel bad if you don't get to ask.
Okay, so the next question is there, Joshua, at the end.
Okay, Joshua, first of all, it's great to have you here. You're like one of the best living documentary directors, and it's an honor to speak to you. You're like taking a cult status in the world of documentary film. And I have one question. I'm not sure if I'll articulate it very good because I'm not very fluent in English, but it concerns me about USA policies and about your movies. So when you look for USA policy, you always see where there is war, where there is interest, influence, the US is in there. So you see Vietnam War, you see Korea War, even now in Ukraine what is happening. So everywhere there is the US. My question is, how much did the US policy influence the mass killings that happened in your movies?
Okay.
Okay, and please the question for the lady here.
Well, I have one question. I couldn't escape watching the film. It was too much light in a bunker. Well, they were billionaires, but they might have had also a small nuclear power plant for such a long-lasting electricity. Usually in the bunkers, it's not that light.
But was that a question about how they do the aha? So I think I will maybe I'll take them in.
Yeah, choose the order you want.
Yeah.
Tarkovsky.
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah, I'll start with the United States. When you were talking about U.S. policy and you mentioned Ukraine, I will come to the role of the U.S. Well, I'll start with that. No, the U.S. provided the radios for the death squad leaders in Indonesia to commute, and the army. They provided the radios for the army to coordinate the genocide across the entire archipelago, this vast 5,000-kilometer-long archipelago. They produced death lists that they handed to the Indonesian army and asked that the Indonesian army, lists of people they asked the Indonesian army to capture and kill. They listened in to the radios because they provided them and went through and were able to check off who on the lists was killed. They provided weapons, they provided money. The death squad leaders in the city of Medan, where I filmed, would travel around the city with the U.S. Consul General, I only learned this later, and take them to the places where they killed to sort of give the progress on the killings. I found one haunting note in some censored U.S. State Department files that had been leaked, and it said date, no date. So there's a column that said date, and then because they decided not to put a date, they wrote no date. 10,500 people killed at the North Sumatra's Snake River. That's the spot on the river where the two men in the Look of Silence go down and show how they killed people. So this was America's genocide too. And what's interesting, and one of the things that the film did, that the two films did, but I think of them as one, I think of them as two parts of one film. But one of the things they did is transform how Indonesia talks about its past. And that they haven't transformed Indonesian politics, but they've provided a reference that is now taught in schools, that people know that the genocide was a genocide and that there was impunity for it and that the corruption that rules the country today emerged from out of that genocide, out of that new regime, that regime change that involved the slaughter of somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people, depending on how one estimates it. And one of the things we did was push, as the films were being released, for the United States to declassify its documents about its role in the killings. And in the end, I thought we'd failed, but shortly into Trump's first term, the National Declassification Center, which was still staffed by Obama appointees, suddenly released, I think it was 35,000 State Department documents detailing America's complicity in the genocide. They did not release the military files, which would be more revealing, and they did not release the intelligence or CIA files, which would be probably most revealing. But this was crucial because it allowed Indonesian human rights campaigners to rebut the official Indonesian government position that this was a spontaneous uprising of a people who hated communism. Because they were able to provide, suddenly there were 35,000 documents explaining how the Indonesian army was prepared to carry out these atrocities and then how they ultimately did, which just sort of meant that laid the groundwork for kind of all sorts of truth, reconciliation, and justice initiatives that happened at the grassroots level that never really became a national program. So it was America's genocide too. It's my history as an American. And it's maybe Yugoslavia's history as well, because Sukarno and Tito were the kind of leaders of the non-aligned movement. And of course that was why America committed the genocide. What's interesting is to kill people, to carry out that slaughter, America back then had to have a great moral purpose. They had to say, you know, we're fighting, they had to call Sukarno a kind of closet communist and say this country's about to become fully communist and we have to carry out this, we have to defeat the communists, and in the name of freedom. Nowadays, with the new American policy in Ukraine, I think we're just happy just being pure buzzards. We're like vultures. We're just, doesn't matter which side it doesn't matter who's running the country so long as we can get the go into the battlefield, pick out the minerals among the corpses. So I don't know if we're in like a post-moral era where sheer bling, AI-generated hype, just sheer sentiment created through like the musical numbers at their most crazy in the end, like the Father's song, The Big Blue Sky, if that's enough to justify anything. I think about that because, or Born Free in the Act of Killing, I think about that because in a way, we have a I don't know, there's just no need to even claim to be on the right side anymore. I don't know if that's...
What is the right side?
Yeah.
What is the right side?
The right side is the honest side that but now there's not even a need to create a moral pretext. I was thinking about musicals. I sort of lost my thread for a moment there. I didn't get very self-conscious as I froze, but I didn't remember what I was going to say, but now I do. No, the thing is, one of the things I noticed about the end, and maybe it applies to politics globally, is that when the characters, one of the things that gets the characters singing is when their excuses, their rationalizations start to fail. And they shift modes from excusing, rationalizing, saying they're on the right side morally, to pure sentimentalization. And in a sense, that's what all the aesthetics of the MAGA movement do. And it's what this new approach, it doesn't matter who's running Ukraine, we're going to just go in there and take out the minerals. You can just be...
Okay, I would now, because we have to lead it towards the end, I would censor any other interruptions if possible.
I'll come to you now because I'd like to say something about your question about the nuclear. It wasn't really a question, but it was a comment about the nuclear power plant. I visited many real bunkers, and many of the facilities in the bunker in the end come from these real bunkers. None of them had nuclear power plants, although they could have. It's a good idea, but it's expensive. They had huge amounts of diesel and a machine for filtering the diesel so that it lasts for hundreds and hundreds of years. They had freezers down to minus 200 degrees that would keep Christmas turkeys and hams endlessly edible. The fat would never go rancid as it might in a home freezer. So they had 200, one bunker I visited had 250 Christmas turkeys. It's a very good question, how many condoms? But I want to just speak to how the film was born. I wanted to make a third film in Indonesia about the oligarchs who enriched themselves by exploiting a country that was terrified of them. And after the act of killing came out, I wasn't allowed to return to Indonesia anymore. I've been banned ever since. So I started investigating oligarchs elsewhere who'd made their money through violence, and I found this family of an oil tycoon from Central Asia who had used violence and worked with his country's army to obtain his oil concessions, his drilling rights, to clear the land where he built his oil fields. And he invited me on a shopping expedition to see his bunker, to see a bunker he invited me on a shopping expedition to tour a bunker that he was thinking of buying. And as we toured this place, I was just haunted. I was haunted by, first, for the father, for this oil tycoon, how will you cope with your guilt for the catastrophe from which you would be fleeing? He believed that climate change, the effects of runaway climate change, would likely lead to the breakdown of civilization in a kind of Mad Max dystopia on the surface of the earth. He didn't think that the world would just become too hot for us to live in, but he thought that in certain areas it would, and you'd have billions of people on the move. It would, trying to escape those areas, it would be unstoppable. You'd have the breakdown of nation states. You'd have warlordism with nuclear weapons falling into the hands of private armies. You'd get regional nuclear wars, which would spiral into ever bigger nuclear wars. And you would just have the complete collapse of the conditions that make our species viable. And so I thought, how will you cope with your guilt for this if you think you're part of what's causing it? And then his wife was all the while on the way to the bunker texting with cousins and her extended family. And then it was quite clear when we got in, she showed me the rooms they were planning, and there would only be room for just a few people. And I thought, how will you cope with your remorse for leaving loved ones behind? And I was haunted because I could imagine that she must already be preparing the people in her life for that eventual betrayal. And I thought those relationships that could sustain you and be rich and honest and loving must be hollow. And I thought about my parents, who I know if something happens to one of them would like nothing more than to come live with me. And that may or may not be the best thing for whichever parent survives. And it may not be the best thing for me, but it might be. But if I just followed the path of least resistance and said no and gently arranged to give them a more sensible option and put them in a care home, or first a home care and then a care home, and then followed the path of least resistance and never spoke of it with them again, I would have lost in that moment my father or my mother for the rest of their days on earth. And in that sense, I think we come to what the film is really about at its core, which is love, and how our capacity for love and compassion becomes hollow when we're unable to be honest with each other, when we lie to ourselves and out of shame or defensiveness or fear impose those lies on the people close to us. When we do that, we can no longer cherish and protect the people we love, because our relationships, far from being life-affirming sources of connection and truth that then and solidarity that then grows outward from ourselves into the wider human family, they become a minefield of silences, and silences about what's most important. And I, again, don't say this to be a scold. I say it because that's all we have. And I thought to myself, the only film I can imagine making with this tragic, broken, very small, very rich family is the documentary set in the bunker 25 years after they move in. But I'm not on the right side of the line, I'm not going to be invited.
Who knows?
And who knows? And I thought, on my way home, I know what I'll do. I'll make a musical set in the bunker, because that's what makes this about self-deception, as I said earlier. And to come back to that final question about my influences as a filmmaker, just raise your hand who asked so I can, there you are. I don't really, you asked, do I have filmmakers whose way of working influenced me? And I think that was interesting. I think that's how you phrased it. Because what Dusan taught me, what other friends who are filmmakers I admire taught me, like Werner Herzog, what filmmakers I don't know have taught me just by looking at their work and studying it, is while I can pick up some tips and techniques, filmmaking, like any journey in life, if you're not in the service of a big industrial lie machine, is a journey hopefully toward truth and self-knowledge and honesty. And so no, I don't make films like anyone else. I don't make documentaries like myself, because with every project it's a new exploration. And I just find the form, starting with the method that then turns into a form, to take as honest a journey as I feel, as I have the courage to take, and the self-understanding to take at that moment in time. And in that sense, it's a metaphor for life and what I've said we should all do right now, which is to just look into ourselves, be present in this moment, ask how we got here, and ask what it demands of us.
Thank you so much for this beautiful conclusion. And I just want to use the opportunity to invite you all tomorrow. Joshua is still here in Rijeka, and at the Art Kino there will be the projections of Act of Killing, A Look of Silence, and a Q&A with Joshua afterwards.
What time?
At 5 and at 8, I think, if I'm not wrong.
I'll be there.
Okay. See you soon. Thanks so much.